You are not as African as you think you are. And Africa is not what you think it is either. If you've ever taken a DNA test and seen a number next to the word African, 78%, 82%, 91%, whatever it was, you probably assumed that number meant something simple, that it connected you cleanly to a continent, one place, one people, one story. It doesn't. And the real story is stranger, more painful, and more powerful than the number on your screen ever told you. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why that percentage was never the full truth, and what 2025's newest genetic data just revealed about it that no test result has ever shown before. Because here's what almost nobody explains when they hand you that percentage. Africa is not one genetic population. It never was. It is the single most genetically diverse landmass on Earth, more diverse than Europe, more diverse than Asia, more diverse than the Americas. And most of it has never even been mapped by modern science. So when a DNA company tells you you are African, what they're actually doing is taking an enormous, ancient, endlessly varied continent and compressing it into a single word. That's not a discovery. That's a simplification. And in 2025, that simplification finally started to break apart. Let's start with the number everyone already half knows. Multiple large-scale genetic studies, going back over a decade and confirmed again by newer research, put the average African. American genome at somewhere between 75 and 85% African ancestry, with the remaining 15 to 25% coming from European ancestry. Some individuals sit closer to 90%, some sit closer to 60%. The variation is enormous, and it's because this isn't one clean historical event. It's the genetic residue of 400 years of forced migration, survival, and mixing that no history textbook ever fully accounted for. But here's the detail that changes everything. When researchers actually traced where in Africa that ancestry comes from, they found it isn't spread evenly across the continent. It isn't Ethiopian, it isn't Zulu, it isn't Maasai. The overwhelming majority of it traces back to West Africa, the coastal and inland regions that were the primary source zones for the transatlantic slave trade. That means when someone says African American DNA, what they usually mean, genetically, is a specific and traceable slice of West African ancestry, not a random sample of an entire continent. That's not a small correction. That's the difference between connected to a continent and connected to specific nations, specific ethnic groups, specific bloodlines that can now, for the first time, actually be named. This is worth sitting with for a second because most people never hear it framed this way. For generations, the phrase African American carried a kind of built-in vagueness, not by choice, but because the historical record that would have named specific origins was deliberately destroyed. Ship manifests listed cargo, not names. Plantation records listed property, not families. Entire lineages were erased on paper the moment someone was forced onto a ship. So when DNA science finally arrived with the ability to trace ancestry with real precision, it wasn't just answering a curiosity question. It was quietly filling in a blank that slavery itself created on purpose. Let's get even more specific, because vague continental labels are exactly what got us into this confusion in the first place. When researchers dig into which West African nations show up most consistently in African American DNA, the pattern lines up almost exactly with the historical shipping routes of the slave trade itself. Regions in modern-day Senegal, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, Cameroon, Congo, and Angola. These weren't random destinations. They were the ports, the coastal kingdoms, and the trading routes that European slave ships targeted for nearly 4 centuries, based on which regional powers were willing to trade captives for weapons, cloth, and goods. So when a modern test traces someone's ancestry to, say, the Akan people of Ghana, or the Igbo of Nigeria, or the Mende of Sierra Leone, it isn't guessing. It's reconstructing a shipping map that was deliberately hidden from the descendants of the people who were forced onto those ships. This is also where the science gets genuinely more impressive than most people realize. Modern ancestry testing doesn't just look at one type of DNA. It combines autosomal DNA, inherited from both parents and diluted across generations, with mitochondrial DNA passed down only through the maternal line, and in some cases, Y-chromosome DNA passed down only through the paternal line. Each of these tells a slightly different part of the story. Autosomal DNA gives the broad percentage breakdown most people are familiar with. Mitochondrial and Y DNA can trace a single unbroken line, mother to mother to mother, or father to father to father, sometimes back tens of thousands of years, connecting a living person today to a specific ancient migration route out of Africa. When scientists combine all three, they're not just estimating a percentage. They're reconstructing a family tree that history books never wrote down. And now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because it should. That 15 to 20% European ancestry sitting inside the average African American genome isn't a footnote. It's It's a fingerprint of exactly what happened on plantations across the American South. Researchers who studied European genetic contribution across multiple U.S. cities in the Caribbean found something specific in the data. The European ancestry wasn't evenly contributed by men and women. It was heavily skewed toward male contribution. That is not a coincidence, and it is not ancient history dressed up as science. That statistic is the genetic record of coercion, of enslaved women who had no legal right to consent, and enslavers who left permanent evidence of that power in the DNA of generations they would never claim as family. When you see that European percentage on a DNA test, you are not looking at mixed heritage in some neutral romantic sense. You're looking at a documented pattern of sexual violence embedded in the human genome, still measurable 200 years later. This isn't a small statistical footnote either. It's the genetic signature of a system so brutal it left permanent measurable marks on the human genome, still readable 2 centuries later by anyone who knows how to look. And there's a myth this data quietly destroys too, the Native American ancestry story. For generations, many black families passed down a belief that somewhere back in the family tree, there was Cherokee blood, or Blackfoot blood, or some other indigenous line, often tied to real oral history about escaped or freed people finding refuge in Native communities. But when geneticists actually tested large African American populations for Native American genetic markers, they found almost none. Very little, almost negligible. That doesn't mean those family stories are lies. Relationships, adoption, and community integration happened without leaving a genetic trace in every case. But it does mean the DNA itself tells a much more concentrated story. Overwhelmingly West African, with a specific and traceable European admixture layered on top by force, not by choice. It's worth pausing here to address something directly, because this exact kind of data has been twisted before, and it will be twisted again. None of this is about ranking ancestries, proving purity, or suggesting that a higher African percentage makes someone more anything. Genetic ancestry is not the same thing as race, and it is definitely not the same thing as identity, culture, or belonging. Race is a social construct built on visible traits and historical power structures. Ancestry is a measurable trail of inherited DNA segments. They overlap, but they are not the same tool, and using one to make claims about the other is exactly the kind of misuse that legitimate geneticists have spent decades warning against. This data exists to reconnect people to stolen history, not to build a new hierarchy on top of an old one. So if the African side of the equation isn't one thing, what is it actually made of? This is where the real reveal happens, and it's not about African Americans at all. It's about Africa. Scientists have known for years that Africa holds more human genetic diversity than any other continent on the planet, and it isn't close. The reason is simple once you hear it. Modern humans originated in Africa, which means African populations have had the longest amount of time, tens of thousands of years longer than anywhere else, to accumulate genetic variation. Every population outside of Africa descended from a relatively small group that migrated out. That means every non-African population on Earth, from Scandinavians to Japanese to indigenous Australians, is genetically a subset of the diversity that already existed inside Africa before anyone left it. Africa isn't just one piece of the human puzzle, it's most of the puzzle. And yet, here's the part that should make you angry. The continent that holds the deepest, richest genetic history of our entire species is also the least studied. There are more than 2,000 distinct and ethno-linguistic groups across Africa. Genetic data exists in detail for fewer than 100 of them. Think about what that means. It means the vast majority of African genetic diversity has simply never been sequenced, cataloged, or compared. Scientists have compared it to having a map of a massive city where only 5% of the streets are drawn in, and the rest of the map is just blank space. That blank space isn't empty because there's nothing there. It's blank because nobody funded the expedition to go map it. To put that diversity gap in perspective, 2 people from neighboring villages in some parts of Africa can be more genetically different from each other than a person from Norway is from a person in Japan. That single fact alone should end any conversation that treats African DNA as one uniform category. It also explains why, for years, commercial DNA tests could only tell African-descended customers something as broad as West African or Sub-Saharan African, while a white American customer with English and German ancestry might get a breakdown specific enough to name the county their ancestors came from. That gap wasn't because African ancestry was somehow less traceable by nature. It was because the reference databases simply hadn't been built yet, because the funding, the research partnerships, and the priorities hadn't caught up to the science. That underrepresentation has real consequences, and not just academic ones. Because most large-scale genetic and medical research has historically been built on European ancestry populations, disease markers, drug response models, and risk predictions are all calibrated primarily around that genetic backdrop. When researchers looked specifically at type 2 diabetes risk in African Americans, they found the disease risk was roughly double that of European Americans. And even after adjusting for income, environment, and lifestyle factors, a measurable part of that gap correlated directly with the proportion of African ancestry in a person's genome. That is not a story about behavior. That is a story about medicine built on an incomplete map, applied to bodies the map was never designed for. And diabetes is only one example. Researchers studying genetic variation across African populations have repeatedly found disease-relevant genetic markers, some tied to blood pressure regulation, some tied to immune response, some tied to how bodies process certain medications, that show up at meaningfully different frequencies across different African ethnic groups. That means a drug dosage calibrated on a study population from one part of Africa, or from African Americans as a broad category, may not be equally accurate for someone whose specific ancestry traces to a different region entirely. This is exactly why researchers now argue that treating African ancestry as one box on a medical form is not just scientifically lazy, it can be a genuine barrier to accurate healthcare for millions of people. The push to build higher resolution African genetic databases isn't just about family history. It's about closing a medical blind spot that has existed for as long as modern genomic medicine has existed. Now, in November of 2025, something happened that actually started to close that gap. And this is the update almost nobody outside the genetics world has heard about yet. One of the largest DNA testing companies in the world announced what they called a landmark expansion of African ancestry data. More than 250 high-resolution genetic groups across the African continent, up from just 25. That's a tenfold increase in resolution, built from years of community partnerships and DNA samples collected specifically from people with documented, verified ancestry inside African nations. For the first time, more than 80% of Black and African American customers using the newest testing technology are now matching to one or more of these high-resolution groups. That's not a small technical update. That's the difference between a test telling you West Africa in vague continental strokes and a test telling you a specific region, a specific ethnic group, sometimes a specific set of communities your ancestors most likely came from before the ships ever left the coast. This update didn't come from nowhere either. It was built through years of direct partnership with African communities. DNA samples collected specifically from individuals with 4 grandparents documented as born in the same African country, combined with public. Scientific data sets and years of independent research contributions from African and diaspora communities worldwide. In other words, this wasn't a lab in Silicon Valley guessing at African genetics from a distance. It was built slowly and deliberately with the direct participation of the very populations it now describes. That matters, because so much of the historical relationship between genetic science and Black communities, from unethical medical experimentation to extractive research practices, has been built on exploitation rather than partnership. A dataset built this way is, at minimum, a meaningful correction to that history. Think about what a tenfold jump actually represents in practice. Before this update, someone might have taken a test years ago and been told simply 70% Nigerian. After this expansion, that same underlying DNA can now potentially be matched against dozens of distinct, high-resolution genetic groups within Nigeria alone, clusters tied to specific regions, specific historical migration patterns, specific communities that still exist today with their own languages, traditions, and oral histories. That's the difference between being told you come from a country and being told, with real scientific confidence, which part of that country and which people within it are your ancestors most likely belong to. For millions of African Americans, this is the closest science has ever come to answering a question that history deliberately erased. The transatlantic slave trade didn't just steal labor and freedom. It systematically destroyed records, separated families, renamed people, and severed the paper trail that every other American ethnic group has been able to use to trace their roots back home. You can find a ship's manifest for an Irish immigrant who arrived in 1850. You cannot find a name, a village, or family record for the overwhelming majority of enslaved Africans brought to American shores. DNA is not a replacement for that stolen history, but for the first time, it is starting to function as a partial substitute, a way to reconnect a scattered diaspora to something that was taken by force and never returned. So let's put the whole picture together, because this is where it stops being abstract science and starts being personal. If you are a Black American and you've taken a DNA test, the number you saw is real, but it was never the full story. The African percentage is not Africa in some generalized sense. It is, with very high probability, a specific and traceable line back to West African nations and ethnic groups whose names and cultures still exist today. The European percentage is not a neutral mixing of cultures. It is documented, measurable evidence of a specific and violent history that shaped the modern demographics of an entire nation. and the Native American ancestry many families believed in, while culturally and historically real in many individual family histories, is largely absent at the genetic level for the population as a whole. And if you're looking at this as someone from the African continent, watching this conversation from Lagos or Accra or Dakar or anywhere else, the message is just as important. The idea that Africa is genetically one thing that Black Americans either do or don't fully belong to has never been scientifically accurate. Africa is not a single population. It's not even close. It's dozens of ancient, distinct, deeply diverse peoples who happen to share a continent, and the specific nations tied to the slave trade represent only a fraction of the total genetic diversity that exists across the whole landmass. Reconnecting to Africa was never really about reconnecting to a continent. It was always about reconnecting to specific places, specific peoples, specific histories that colonial violence tried to erase from memory but could not erase from DNA. That's the real reveal here. Not a competition, not a hierarchy, not some hidden secret designed to divide two groups of people who share a far more history, ancestry, and struggle than any label could separate. The real reveal is this. For centuries, the historical record told African Americans they had no traceable past before slavery. The DNA record, only now becoming precise enough to matter, is quietly proving that claim wrong. One genetic group, one region, one reconnected bloodline at a time. Think about how much has shifted in just the last few years. A decade ago, this entire conversation would have ended at, "You're roughly 70% West African." Today, it can end at a named ethnic group, a specific region, sometimes a specific set of surviving communities who never left. That's not a minor scientific footnote. That's the slow, ongoing reversal of one of the most deliberate erasures in human history. And it's happening right now, in real time, one dataset update at a time. And that is a story worth understanding accurately, because the people it belongs to deserve nothing less than the full truth.